They chose another bride. And when I ran rather than stand at that altar and watch it happen, it took 3 alpha queens and every soldier the Crown Accord could spare to find me before House Ashford made certain I never surfaced again. The morning it happened, I was straightening a veil that was never going to make it to the altar on my head. My hands were steady. That should have warned me. 26 years of being told I was broken had taught me exactly how to hold still while the worst thing in the room walked toward me. Aunt Perpetua pinned the last flower into my hair and told me I looked like my mother. The chapel bells were already ringing 3 streets over. I remember thinking the sound was too cheerful for what my chest already knew. Lady Ashford came through the vestry door without knocking, trailing the scent of crushed violets and expensive smoke, and behind her walked a girl in ivory silk who was not me. She had a small, apologetic smile, as if she too had only just been told. I understood before anyone said a word. The contract had a clause. There is always a clause when the family writing it has more silver than shame. My father's watch was in my palm, the one thing of his I still owned, and my fingers closed around it so hard the cipher wheel inside bit into my skin. If a story like this one is already finding its way into your ears, do the smallest thing that keeps it coming. Subscribe to the channel and stay, because what happened next is the part nobody in that chapel expected. Lady Ashford did not raise her voice. Women like her never have to. She simply informed the priest and the 60 witnesses seated behind him that the Ashford heir would be marrying Dahlia Marsh instead, effective that afternoon, and that the Calloway girls' debt contract was hereby considered satisfied through a modest cash settlement she was already holding out like a tip for bad service. Someone in the third pew laughed. I want to say I don't remember who. I remember exactly who. I am Wren Calloway. I was 26 years old on the day I was traded for a better dowry in front of the only city I had ever lived in. And I want to tell you now, before anything else happens in this story, that the thing everyone called broken in me was the same thing that would later bring 3 of the most feared women in Duskmira to their knees at my door. But that morning, I only knew that my future had been rewritten in a sentence, and that Callan Ashford, the groom, would not meet my eyes. Guard Captain Voss took my elbow the way you'd take the elbow of something spilled and inconvenient. He said the settlement was generous. He said I should be grateful the house hadn't simply voided the contract for cause, given my designation, given the words the physicians had used about my cycles 2 winters ago. Defective was the word he actually used, quietly, close to my ear, like a kindness. My watch hit the stone floor of the vestry when he pulled me toward the door. I heard the case crack. I did not go back for it because his grip had gone from escorting to dragging, and a small, cold voice under my ribs that had kept me alive through worse than this told me that a man does not drag a woman he intends to simply put in a carriage home. I bit him. I am not proud of it, and I am not sorry for it. I broke free at the kitchen passage, went through a delivery door into an alley that smelled of wet stone and coal smoke, and I ran through Duskmare in my wedding dress with my hem tearing and my breath sawing, because some animal part of me had already understood what my mind would only catch up to hours later. The Ashfords had not planned to let me go home at all. A jilted omega with a grudge and a memory for numbers is a loose thread. Loose threads get cut. I did not know, yet, that 3 queens who ruled this city would spend the next 11 days tearing it apart floor by floor, looking for the thread House Ashford wanted gone. 8 years earlier, in the same city, a fire had eaten through the west wing of the Hall of Records at 2 a.m, and a 19-year-old apprentice archivist had gone back in for a box of ledgers instead of running. Because those ledgers were the only proof that a grain contractor had been shorting the city's relief stores for 3 winters running. I know this part of the story secondhand, told to me so many times since by the woman who lived it, that I can see it now as though I had been standing beside myself. The apprentice was me. The woman who found me on her hands and knees in smoke thick enough to chew, coughing up a ledger box she'd refused to drop, was Tallis Draven, 23 years old then, not yet a queen, not yet called the Iron Widow, only a junior commander doing a walkthrough she had no real reason to be doing. She told me later that she smelled me before she saw me. Warm beeswax and kinsey, she said, cutting straight through ash and char like something that refused to belong to the fire at all. She carried me out over one shoulder. She did not ask my name. I did not offer it. I was ashamed of being caught doing something reckless and righteous in the same breath, and she was already being called away to the next crisis, because that is what her life was, then and always. But she told me, years afterward, that she remembered the scent for 8 years the way you remember a debt you never got to repay, and that she had gone looking for beeswax and quinsay in every crowded room she ever stood in since, without knowing she was doing it. I became, after that fire, careful in a new way. I finished my apprenticeship. I took a quiet post copying deeds in the Hall of Records, the kind of position nobody envies and nobody watches. And in the dark, under a second name that belonged to no one, I became the quiet ledger. It started small. A tip slipped into a locked box at the Office of Weights, an anonymous note pointing at a shipping manifest that didn't add up. Then another. The Crown Accord. The triarchy of 3 alpha queens who had ruled Duskmere jointly since before I was born, used the Office of Weights as their eyes into every counting house in the city, and somewhere in that office, a woman named Isolde Marrow decided the anonymous ledger tips were too precise, too patient, too good to ignore, and started leaving return notes in the same dead drop. We built an entire correspondence out of numbers and never once traded names. I told myself it was safer that way. I told myself a great many things were safer that way. What I was building, quietly, patiently, for 3 years, was a case against House Ashford. Silver reserves that left the treasury and did not arrive where the manifests claimed. A pattern only visible if you had memorized, the way I had. The particular slant of Lady Ashford's underclerk's handwriting on every falsified receipt. I did not know that House Ashford had, in the last 6 months, begun to suspect a leak inside their own accounts, or that they had narrowed it down to someone inside the Hall of Records with unsupervised access to the archive vaults. I did not know that the marriage contract binding me to their son had originally been drafted as a way to keep that someone close and controllable. I did not know, on my wedding morning, that the moment they'd found a wealthier bride to replace me, they had also quietly decided that the safest way to handle a discarded Omega, who might know too much, was to make certain she disappeared somewhere nobody would think to look, filed under heartbreak instead of murder. I only knew that I was running, in torn silk, through streets that were starting to empty for evening curfew, and that the alley ahead of me ended in a wall. Guard Captain Voss was not alone. 2 more men in Ashford livery came around the corner behind me, unhurried, the way men move when they believe the outcome is already decided. I remember pressing my back to cold brick and thinking, with a clarity that frightened me more than the men did, that I had spent 3 years feeding evidence to a stranger through a locked box, and that stranger did not know my name, and no one was coming. That was the last completely wrong thing I believed that year. A patrol whistle cut the street in half before Voss's hand closed on my wrist, 3 short blasts that every soldier in Duskmere had been trained since childhood to answer, and from the mouth of the alley came a woman I would later learn had not walked a routine patrol in 11 years, because queens do not walk routine patrols. Except that this one still did, twice a month, on the anniversary of a wife she had buried and never once mentioned by name. She did not draw a blade. She did not need to. She simply stepped into the light enough that Voss's men could see the sigil at her collar, and the temperature of the alley changed the way a room changes when a storm walks into it wearing a person's shape. Black pepper and wet slate rolled off her like a warning flare, and underneath my own panic something in me went suddenly, absurdly still, recognizing a scent I had not smelled in 8 years and had never entirely stopped looking for in crowds. "Commander," he started, and she said, without raising her voice at all, "Queen, now, and you will address me as such. And then you will explain to me why 3 Ashford men are handling a woman half your size like cargo on a public street." I don't remember deciding to speak. I remember the words coming out of me anyway, thin and furious. They tried to marry me to their son this morning and then decided I was cheaper to disappear. Voss's men did not stay to hear the rest of that conversation. They had the sense, at least, to run. Queen Tallis Draven did not ask me if I was hurt. She asked me my name, and when I gave it to her, she said it back to me once, testing its weight, and then she said the 4 words that would end up carved into the center of everything that followed. "I don't leave debts unaccounted." She meant the fire. I understood that later, in that alley, soaked in rain that had just begun, wearing a dress that no longer belonged to any future I recognized. I only understood that a queen had appeared out of the dark and looked at me like I was a ledger she intended to balance personally, and that for the first time since Voss's hand had closed on my elbow that morning, I felt something other than afraid. She took me, not to a cell or a shelter, but to the north tower of the Crown Accord's own keep, through a side door that avoided every window facing the street, and she did not explain herself until we were 3 floors up, and the door had locked behind us. "You'll stay here tonight," she said. "Tomorrow I have questions. Tonight you sleep, and no one touches you. And if that frightens you more than the alley did, you're allowed to say so. It should have frightened me more. Strange rooms usually did. Instead, the room smelled, faintly, of black pepper and wet slate layered over old stone, and something in my chest that had been clenched since the vestry door opened that morning loosened by 1 single degree. I did not sleep much. I sat by the window and turned my father's cracked watch over in my hands, the cipher wheel inside it jammed at an angle it had never sat at before, and I thought about the fact that I had just watched a queen's face change at the smell of me, and I did not yet have language for what that meant. The next morning, I met the other 2. Syra Bellwether arrived first, scorched cedar and hot copper trailing behind her like smoke from a forge, moving through the tower with the brisk, itemizing energy of a woman who had never once in her life entered a room without first calculating what it would cost her to leave it. She looked at me the way an appraiser looks at an object whose provenance doesn't match its paperwork, not unkindly, just precisely. "So you're the ledger," she said, before I had said a single word to confirm it. I went very still. "I don't know what you mean." "You do." She set a folder on the table between us, and inside it, in my own careful hand, was a photostat of a note I had left in the office of Waite's dead drop 14 months earlier, pointing at a discrepancy in a grain manifest that had, eventually, cost a corrupt contractor his license and his freedom. "Isolde's been trying to find you for 3 years. I only had to compare your Hall of Records intake slip to your handwriting samples this morning to do it in 20 minutes. You should feel free to be insulted by that." The third woman, when she came, said almost nothing at all, which somehow told me more about her than either of the others' full sentences had. Isolde Marrow moved like she'd trained herself out of taking up space, smoked amber and riverstone clinging close instead of announcing itself across a room, and she set a small locked box on the table, the very dead Dropbox I had fed 100 anonymous notes into over 3 years, and simply opened it in front of me. "I kept every one," she said. I always wondered what kind of person notices this much and asks for nothing in return. She looked at me for a long moment. "I don't like being wrong about people. I was wrong about assuming you were older. I sat in that tower room, 26 years old, jilted the previous morning in front of half the city, and understood, slowly, with the particular vertigo of watching two unrelated lives collide, that the anonymous work I had done in the dark to feel less powerless had somehow led 3 queens directly to my door, not because of who I had married, or failed to marry, but because of who I actually was. Why does House Ashford want me gone badly enough to make it look like grief?" I asked, instead of just letting me disappear on my own the way they clearly expected. Tallis answered that one, arms crossed, black pepper sharpening at the edges the way I would learn it did whenever she was angry on someone else's behalf. "Because grief doesn't talk, and you know exactly how much silver has gone missing from that house's shipping contracts over 3 winters, don't you?" I did. Down to the coin. That was the reveal that ended the first quiet day of the rest of my life. Not a kiss, not a confession, but 3 queens realizing, in the space of one morning, that the invisible woman they'd each separately been looking for, without knowing it was the same person standing in front of all of them, and that House Ashford had jilted her in public not out of cruelty alone, but because they needed the world to already believe she was unstable, discarded, and worth nothing before they made her disappear for good. For 3 days after that, the tower became a kind of strange, careful home. Nobody touched me without asking first, not a hand at my elbow, not a hand at my back, and I came to understand that this was not an accident, but a rule. One Isolde stated plainly on the second morning, watching me flinch away from a servant reaching to take my cloak. "Nothing happens to you here that you haven't said yes to first. Not once. Not ever. If that's new to you, I'm sorry it is." It was new. I did not tell her that. I think she already knew. Syra taught me, without seeming to teach me anything, how the Treasury's real books worked beneath the ones shown to auditors, sliding ledgers across the table and watching my eyes move faster than my mouth could keep up with. "You see it in 9 seconds, she said once, timing me with a small brass clock she kept in her coat pocket, apparently for no other reason than to enjoy being right about things. "Do you know how long it takes my best auditor? 40. You've been doing this alone in a records closet for 3 years, and nobody noticed you were the sharpest mind in this city." "They noticed I was an omega with bad cycles," I said. "That's what they wrote in my file." Something moved behind her eyes, quick and hard. "Then, the file is wrong, and we are going to prove it is wrong in front of everyone who ever read it." Tallis found me on the 3rd night on the tower's narrow balcony, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of her, watching the city lights the way I used to watch the archive fire 8 years before, like something both beautiful and dangerous, worth staring at longer than was safe. "You went back in for the ledgers," she said, without preamble. "That night, everyone else ran, and you went back in for a box of paper. It was evidence. People would have gone hungry if that contractor kept skimming relief grain. You could have died for paper. You could have died coming back in for me." I glanced at her. "We're not so different." She was quiet for a long moment, black pepper and wet slate settling around us both in the cold air. "My wife died 11 years ago," she said finally, Flat, the way you say something you've practiced saying without feeling it. Not in a fire. A poisoning meant for me, at a dinner she wasn't supposed to attend. I decided afterward that the safest thing I could do for anyone I let close was to feel as little as possible where they could see it. It's not strength. I know that now. It's just very good armor. Why tell me that? Because you smell like the first thing I've wanted in 11 years that isn't a debt I owe someone else. She said it the way she said everything, plainly, without flourish, and then added, "Tell me to stop talking, and I will." "Don't stop," I said, and meant it more than I'd meant almost anything in my life. She didn't touch me that night. She stood beside me until the cold drove us both inside, and at the door to my room she said only, "Ask me for anything with your words, Wren Calloway. I will always give you an honest answer," and left me standing there with my heart going like a struck bell. I should say, because it matters to everything that came after, that I did not yet trust any of this. I had spent my whole adult life being told, in 100 small careful ways, that I was a defect to be managed rather than a person to be wanted, and 3 queens being kind to me in a locked tower did not erase 26 years of that lesson in 3 days. I lay awake turning my father's watch over and over, its cracked case still jammed, and I thought, this is either the safest place I have ever stood, or the most dangerous trap that has ever been built around me, and I do not yet know which. I would find out on the 5th day, when House Ashford's men found me first. It happened on the 5th day, in the 1 hour the tower's guard rotation had a gap Isolde herself had flagged as a risk 2 years earlier, and no one had fixed, because that is how disasters actually happen, not through some grand villain's genius, but through an ordinary crack nobody closed in time. I had gone, against every piece of advice I'd been given, to the Hall of Records myself, because Nadia Fenn, the one friend I had left in that building, had sent word through a runner that the Ashford under clerk's original ledgers, the ones I had built my entire anonymous case on, were being quietly pulled and burned that very afternoon, and if I didn't retrieve the originals now, the only proof I had would exist nowhere but my memory, which is not evidence anyone can hang a conviction on. Nadia met me at the service entrance, sharp-tongued and terrified in equal measure, the way she'd been since we were girls copying deeds side by side. "You look like a queen dressed you," she said, eyeing the coat Tallis had put over my shoulders that morning without either of us discussing it. "Don't start. I'm not starting anything, I'm observing. 3 of them, Wren, 3. Most people can't hold the attention of one alpha long enough to get a decent conversation, and you've got the whole crown accord smelling like a proposal in progress. We have 4 minutes before the archive clerk's shift changes," I said, and she laughed despite herself, because some rhythms between old friends never break, not even under a death threat. We found the box. We did not find it in time. Guard Captain Voss was waiting in the stairwell with 4 men, and this time no whistle came from the mouth of any alley to save me, because no one knew I had come here. Because I had told no one, because some part of me, some old, well-worn part, had still believed that this was my mess to fix quietly and alone, rather than a thing I was permitted to ask 3 terrifying, powerful women to help me carry. "Lady Ashford sends her regrets," Voss said, and I understood, in the second before his hand closed on my arm again, that regrets in his mouth meant something final. I bit him again. It did not work twice. I was in the back of a covered cart within 90 seconds, the ledger box gone, Nadia's scream cut short by a hand over her mouth before they shoved her aside, rather than take her too, and the last thing I saw through a gap in the canvas as the cart lurched into motion was the Hall of Records receding into the gray afternoon. And I remember thinking, with a strange, distant calm. That I had finally, completely disappeared, exactly the way House Ashford had wanted from the beginning, except that now it would look like nothing more than a heartbroken Omega finally running from a city that shamed her. I was wrong about one thing. I had told Tallis 2 nights before, half joking, that if anything ever happened to me, she should look for the watch. I had not explained what I meant. I had simply pressed my father's cracked pocket watch into her palm before I left the tower that morning, an instinct I didn't examine at the time, and said, "If I'm not back by dark, this will tell you where I went." I did not fully understand my own gift until the men holding me pulled it from around my neck 3 hours later and threw it into a corner of the cellar they locked me in, cracked case and all, and I heard it strike stone and go silent, and some small stubborn part of me thought, "Good. Let it stop counting for me. Let someone else start." They would tell me, all 3 of them, weeks later, exactly what happened in the city while I sat in that cellar beneath what I would later learn was an Ashford grain warehouse near the river docks, and I have heard the story often enough now that I can walk myself through it as if I had watched it happen from the ceiling. Tallis found the empty tower room first, my absence registering in her the way a missing heartbeat registers in a chest, and she did not shout. Isolde told me later that was the single most frightening thing about that night, that Tallis went completely silent, and silence from her had always, in 11 years, preceded exactly one thing: the complete and total mobilization of every soldier, spy, and informant Duskmara possessed. She had the watch in her coat pocket within the hour, and it meant nothing to her until Isolde, turning it over under a lamp, found the seam I had never told anyone about and pried the back panel loose to reveal the cipher wheel I had built into it myself 2 years earlier. My father's old habit turned into something useful, a tool for encoding messages no one but the quiet ledger's few. Correspondents would know how to read. Except I had, without planning to, aligned it 3 nights earlier to a setting that spelled, in the private cipher only Isolde and I had ever used. 4 words. Near river. Ashford grain. She built an emergency beacon into a broken watch and told you it was sentimental, Isolde said to Tallis that night, half in awe, half in fury at herself for not seeing it sooner. She has been leaving herself an exit for years and never once used it before now, because she never let herself believe anyone was actually coming. Syra had the warehouse ownership records cross-referenced against Ashford shell accounts inside 20 minutes, because that particular skill of finding money's fingerprints on things it wanted to pretend it had never touched was the one place her competence and mine had always run in parallel. 6 warehouses along that stretch of river technically belong to companies that only exist on paper, she reportedly said, laying the map flat on the war table. One of them received a delivery of nothing this afternoon. No goods logged in, no goods logged out, just a cart. They did not wait for morning. They did not wait for permission from anyone, because there was no one above the 3 of them to ask. I did not know any of this while it was happening. I knew a cold cellar floor and the smell of grain dust and river damp and a single lamp someone had left burning out of either carelessness or a small unexpected mercy. And Lady Ashford's voice, eventually, coming down the stairs to look at what her men had caught. She did not look at me the way she had looked at me across the vestry 3 days earlier, brisk and dismissive. She looked at me the way you look at a fire you are trying to decide whether you can still stamp out before it spreads. "You should have taken the settlement," she said. "You should have gone quietly. Instead, you built a case against my family in secret for 3 years and handed it to the one office in this city that could actually use it against me. And now 3 queens are asking questions about a woman my son was supposed to marry and quietly forget." Then, let me go, I said, and answer their questions honestly, and see what happens. She laughed. Short and without warmth. You mistake me for someone who believes in fair outcomes. I built this family's fortune on the belief that outcomes are made, not found. You are an inconvenience I am going to make disappear the way inconveniences always disappear in this city, if you have the sense to notice how many of them already have. I want to tell you I was brave in that cellar. Mostly I was cold and furious and thinking with the same stubborn clarity that had kept me alive in the fire 8 years earlier, that if I was going to die in a grain warehouse over 3 years of careful arithmetic, I would at least make her say out loud, to my face, everything she had done, in case anyone ever came looking and needed to hear it repeated back. Tell me the number, I said. The real one. 3 winters of skimmed relief grain, converted to silver. I've done the sum a dozen times, and I want to hear if I'm right. Something in her face flickered, the vanity of a woman who has spent decades being smarter than everyone in every room she enters, unable to resist correcting an error even from a captive. She told me the number. It was worse than my estimate by nearly a fifth. I would repeat that number, precisely, in front of a room full of witnesses 8 days later, and it would be the single sentence that ended House Ashford. The doors of the warehouse came down at 11 minutes past 2 in the morning, and I know the exact time because I counted every second after I heard the first shout outside, the way I had learned, somewhere in my childhood. To count things when I could not control anything else about a room. Tallis came through first, and I have never, before or since, seen anyone move the way she moved that night, a violence so controlled it looked almost gentle from a distance, 3 of Voss's men down before I'd finished getting to my feet. She found me in the cellar with her bare hands wrapped around the door bar, rather than waiting for a key, black pepper, and wet slate so thick in that small space, it was the only thing I could smell besides my own fear, and when she saw me upright, unbroken, furious rather than broken, something in her whole body seemed to unclench at once. You're late, I told her, because apparently under mortal terror my mouth reverts to instinct rather than gratitude. I'm exactly on time, she said. I don't leave debts unaccounted. And then, quieter, just for me, tell me where it hurts, and I'll start there. Nowhere yet. Ask me again in an hour. Syra came down next with a lantern, and immediately began cataloging everything in the cellar with the ruthless efficiency of a woman who had learned long ago that grief could wait, but evidence could not. Crates, manifests, a second set of books hidden beneath a false floorboard that would, within the week, corroborate every number I had ever sent through that locked box. Isolde came last, having stayed above to make certain Lady Ashford herself did not slip out a side door in the chaos, and when she found her, standing very still in the warehouse office, with a hand halfway to a hidden exit, Isolde said only, I don't like being wrong about people. I was very right about you, and did not let her pass. Guard Captain Voss was taken alive, which turned out to matter more than his own life had ever mattered to him, because a man who beats and abducts women for a living, once cornered, will very quickly discover an enthusiastic memory for exactly whose orders he was following. Lady Ashford was arrested at dawn, still in the same violet-scented traveling coat she'd worn to interrupt my wedding. And the last thing she said to me, before the city guard walked her out into a gray morning that no longer belonged to her, was that I had ruined a family that had given me everything. You gave me a contract that treated me like a debt to be settled, I said. I'm the one who's going to give this city its silver back. The tribunal was held 8 days later in the same chapel where I had been jilted, because Syra insisted on the symmetry with the particular satisfaction of a woman who understood that some justice needs a stage. I stood where the priest had once stood, in front of the same 60 witnesses, plus several hundred more who had heard the story by then and come to see how it ended, and I read the numbers aloud from memory, uninterrupted, down to the last coin, while Syra's auditors confirmed every figure against the recovered ledgers in real time behind me. Lady Ashford was stripped of her house title and her seat on the Merchant Council, her assets seized to repay 3 winters of stolen relief grain, and exiled from Duskmere by a unanimous ruling of the Crown Accord. Callan Ashford, who had stood beside his mother his entire life and never once found the spine to refuse her, lost his inheritance and his name standing, though I asked, publicly, that he be allowed to leave the city quietly rather than face harsher charges, because cowardice is not the same crime as cruelty, and I did not want my justice to cost more than it needed to. Delia Marsh, the bride they had chosen instead of me, stood at the back of that chapel through the whole tribunal and afterward found me in the crowd to say, simply, that she hadn't known any of it, that she was sorry, that she was glad, whatever else was true, that I had lived. I believed her. I told her so. Guard Captain Voss lost his commission and his freedom for a decade. The priest who had let a bride be swapped at his own altar without a word of protest was quietly relieved of his post. Tallis asked me, that same evening, standing in the tower room that had by then quietly become mine, whether I understood what I was walking into if I chose to stay. Say it plainly, I told her. I've had enough of things being decided around me instead of with me. So she did, and Syra did, and Isolde did, each in her own register, Tallis blunt and absolute, Syra precise as an accounting, Isolde quiet and exact. And what all 3 of them were asking, in the end, was whether I would let myself be claimed by all of them at once, bonded into a pack none of us had planned for, and all 3 had apparently wanted since the moment they realized who I was. Tell me to stop, and I will, Tallis said one more time, her hand open on the table between us rather than reaching for me first. Don't stop, I said, and put my hand in hers, and felt Syra's hand cover both of ours, and Isolde's a moment after that, and the room filled, all at once, with beeswax and quinsay tangled through black pepper and wet slate and scorched cedar and copper and smoked amber and riverstone, 6 notes becoming 1 scent I have never, once, in all the time since, been able to fully separate back out again. The bonding happened 3 weeks later, in a small ceremony at the reopened Hall of Records, rather than any grand cathedral, because all 4 of us agreed, without needing to discuss it long, that the place where I had spent years unseen was the place that deserved to see me claimed. Aunt Perpetua stood in the front row in a dress the color of her reopened apothecary's door, which Syra had quietly funded down to the last hinge. Nadia stood beside her, loudly unable to stop crying, which she blamed for weeks afterward on dust. Marshal Beck's Corin, Tallis's own second, who had spent my first days in that tower treating me with open suspicion, stepped forward before the vows to say, gruffly, that in 15 years of service he had never once seen his queen wait for anyone the way she had waited, patiently, completely, for me to decide I was safe. It was, from him, the closest thing to a blessing the room had ever heard, and it undid me more than the vows that followed. The claiming marks were given that night, each in turn, each preceded by the same quiet question, asked and answered 3 separate times before a single tooth touched skin, and I want to say plainly, because it mattered more to me than almost anything else in that whole story, that not one moment of it happened before I said yes with my whole voice. A year later, on a morning with proper sea light instead of tower stone, the four of us stood on a coastline none of us had ever had time to visit before, because I had once told Talus, half asleep and half joking, that I had never in my life seen the ocean, and she had apparently filed that sentence away the way she filed everything that mattered. My father's watch sat repaired on the windowsill of the house we'd taken for the week, its case no longer cracked, its cipher wheel reset to nothing more urgent now than the correct time, ticking quietly into a piece it had never once been allowed to keep before. I think often about the woman standing in that vestry, certain that being unwanted by one family was the worst thing that could happen to her. I would tell her, if I could, that being discarded is not the same as being worthless, that the people who throw you away are very often the ones too small to see what they're losing, and that somewhere out past their small idea of your worth, there is very often someone patient enough, and fierce enough, and honest enough to come looking for exactly the parts of you the world called broken. That is the whole of it. The end. If any part of Ren's story found something true in you, the years spent quietly unseen, the fear of being discarded, the hope that someone patient enough might finally come looking, carry that feeling forward and subscribe to the channel so the next one finds you too. I'd love to know, in the comments, which of the 3 queens you'd have trusted first if you'd been standing in that alley with Ren, the soldier, the strategist, or the spymaster. Thank you for staying until the very last page of this one. Rest easy tonight, and I'll see you inside the next story very soon.